Invasion of the Body Snatchers by Jack Finney. So this is episode 8 of a series I'm doing called The Masterpieces of Science Fiction. I will leave a link to the announcement video that I did. If you haven't watched that yet, I'll leave that down in the description. Now this book, this should be a pretty short review, but I have a couple other things I'd like to talk about. One of them is just a little bit of the history of the book and how it was published. And then the other thing I'd like to talk about is the foreword that was written by Dean Koontz for this edition. So let's start off with the publication of this book. So this was copyrighted in 1955, but I believe it was based on a short story that was written before that. And I think the short story was just called The Body Snatchers. But there was something to do with grave robbing or something like that that they added the invasion of to kind of give it that alien feeling that most people know that this book is about. Now what's interesting is there was a movie that came out originally around that time in the 50s, and then there was another movie that came out in the late 70s, and Jack Finney actually revised the book around that time. And what he did was he brought the story up to that present day. So when you start reading this, it says in 1978. Although it still does kind of seem like it reads like a book from the 50s more than the 70s. I don't think he changed any technology to go along with that, or there wasn't much else changed. The other interesting thing is he wrote in at one point in the book, the two main characters are going to go to a movie, and he actually wrote in that they were going to see a movie of a book he wrote after this was written called Time and Again. So that was kind of interesting. He wrote himself into his own story. And I think there's been like 4 movies made of this. I can't really remember seeing any of them, but after reading the book, I might check out. I think it's the 1978 one that most people like the most. So I might have to watch that at some point, even though I'm not huge into watching movies. So let's get into the plot of this book. This was a 206-page book, this copy I have. And I could summarize the plot really quick here. And I'm going to try to leave this video mostly spoiler-free. In the description of the video, I'm calling it spoiler light, and I will warn people when I get to that point, but it's kind of debatable, I think. So the story takes place in a smallish California town, and it's all from the point of view of the main character who's a doctor in this small town. Now it starts out with an ex-girlfriend shows up to his office, and they dated back in high school, and they're both conveniently recently divorced. So we'll get a little bit of a love story, small love story throughout the whole book based on that. But she has a uncle named Uncle Ira, good name by the way, who she says is just acting kind of strange. So she convinces him to go check it out, and they come back. He comes back, and he gets another person that comes and kind of has the same issue, and then he starts noticing other people around the town just acting a little off. Now there is another couple that he's friends with this couple, and they kind of get brought into the story, and it's mostly the 4 of them running around this town trying to figure out what's happening to the residents of this town. There is some slight horror aspects to this book. I think at the time it was fairly horrific, but I think maybe with some of the reading I've done, I didn't ever find myself that scared or anything like that. But it does kind of have a horror science fiction vibe to it overall. So the book really is them solving this mystery, and it's pretty interesting. I think if you've watched the movie, from what I understand, the book has a completely different ending. I liked the ending, but it did seem abrupt, I'll just put it that way. And I think that's all I really want to say about the plot. Now let's go over some pros and cons. This book, I think, reads very, very fast. I read this in 2 days without even trying. You can see that the text is really big on the page, and it's only 200 pages. I think I could have easily read it in a day if I spent some time and got kind of sucked into it. But 2 days, it seems like I just casually read through it, and it was no issue. And it was entertaining the whole way through. I think the characters were good. I felt like there wasn't a ton of characters, but the characters we did have, there was really only about 5. I felt like he fleshed them out enough in a book like this to where you did kind of feel for him in those horrific parts, and you were rooting for him, and that was definitely a good part of it. Now, the science fiction aspect of this book is pretty good. It might not be that plausible when you really think about it, but it was written quite a while ago, and it's science fiction, so we'll give him a pass on that. The horror element, like I said, at the time, it probably would give people some scares, but me personally, I've read all kinds of kind of horrific stories, and this didn't really faze me at all. So I don't know if that's a pro or con. I'll just throw that out there. And then as far as cons go, the biggest con for me is just the ending. I think it was a little abrupt. It might have left a few loose things out there, but it was good. For a 200-page easy read like this, I'm not going to fault it too much. Overall, highly recommend this book. If I pretty much recommend it to anybody unless you're sensitive to horror. And there are a few, male-female issues that come up in these older books that if you're very sensitive to how men treat women sometimes, like they're a damsel in distress, then this book has a little bit of that, but it didn't seem too bad. So overall, that's about it. I thought I finished the book and I just thought, that was an easy, pulpy, basic read. There is, now we're going to get into a little spoiler light area. So there was a section where some people that had been assimilated by these aliens were trying to convince our main character and this girl that, hey, it's not so bad, just accept it. You're gonna become one of us. And it really brought up a lot of questions of what it is to be human, and it was pretty thought-provoking there, and that kind of carried through to the end. The alien presence in this book is very light, and it kind of doesn't really even show up until later. You don't really know what's going on, but most people are familiar enough with this book that they know it has something to do with an alien invasion. So that's why I'm kind of calling it spoiler light. Now that did have me thinking, and what I do generally is I don't read these forwards, especially in these reprint books, because I don't read the forward because I've had spoilers show up in these. And so when I finished the book, I went back and I read the foreword by Dean Koontz. And he was talking about when this book came out, he was talking about critics saying that this had themes and metaphor that had to do with communism and fascism. And it just really got me thinking. And then I got on the internet and started researching, did I miss something? And later Dean says that he doesn't really believe that. And then when I researched on the internet, apparently the author said no. And if you read the book, there's some pretty blatant reasons why that doesn't really fit. But then Dean Koontz goes on to say it's the same theme of what it is to be human, and he goes into this kind of, I don't want to call it a rant or anything, but he goes on talking about how technology is dehumanizing people, and I may agree in some aspects of that. But he says some pretty interesting things in here. One thing I will read. So Dean wrote this foreword in 2015, so the internet was out and there was a lot of technology already in our lives, but it's obviously grown since then. And he's talking about how the personal computer has eliminated face-to-face meetings where you can see all these nuances and with facial expressions and all this kind of stuff, and how that's in a way dehumanizing. But then he says this really interesting thing. Relationship building at a distance through the filter of a computer is ultimately ineffective for the sincere friend seeker. But it is ideally suited for the sociopath whose powers of manipulation are enhanced when he can operate not merely behind his usual masks, but behind an electronic mask as well. Okay, so that's it for that review, and I think I'm going to go ahead and start book 3 of the Mars trilogy, Blue Mars, and go ahead and finish up that trilogy next. So these books take a little while to read. I might be doing a video in between of a series update for the Easton Press because I've got all the books now. So look for that, and then after that, look for a full spoiler review of the Mars trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.